You can be as sure as you are of your own name that the CIA is working in El Salvador day in and day out, round the clock, with those murderous security services in that country, and with the death squads, which are the very same as the security services. How the question arose at the convention, who really is to govern the United States? And John Jay, the lawyer, had the answer. He said, you know, Jay was the president of the Continental Congress that fought the war for independence against Britain, and he was also the first Chief Justice of the United States. Jay said, well, it's pretty obvious. The people who own the United States ought to govern it. And they adopted his idea. They, of course, wrote the Constitution in order to enhance and protect their private wealth. They wrote it as a document wherein power would reside in private wealth. But there has never been a period in which the agency has not been involved in the international drug trade, most recently with the Contras. And that was the illegal resupply to the Contras in the mid-1980s called the arms supermarket. Pilots had testified that they were flying weapons down to Central America for the Contras and bringing cocaine back into the United States, landing at U.S. military bases with impunity. In Oliver North's cryptic notes that he was not able to erase from the computer before he had to leave the National Security Council offices, there were such things as arms supermarket financed by drugs. Felix, meaning Felix Rodriguez down at Ilopango, Felix talks too much about the VP connection. Panama has gone completely out of the news, hasn't it? But there are 25,000 people whose homes have been destroyed, and of course they're all poor people to begin with. You didn't think the Bush administration was going to go in there and attack any rich neighborhoods. Of course not, the poor neighborhoods. And these people don't have the slightest hope of getting any place to live for more than a year. And they don't even know when they'll ever get a place to live. In one instance, consider this. There is a hangar, aircraft hangar at Albrook Air Force Base, one of the U.S. bases there, holding now 3,000 refugees. They are being held in cubicles 6 feet by 6 feet square with a partition between the one and the other of only 6 feet tall. And these are families. Imagine no privacy, nothing.
Phil Agee was in the CIA for many years. He comments on his experiences and on current events right now on Alternative Views. Phil Agee has returned to the United States after several years in exile, after being hounded by the CIA from one country to the next. This is the second in the two-part series, in which he covers a wide range of subjects, including the Panama invasion, the involvement of the CIA in drug operations, including White House participation in these operations. He also will cover the JFK assassination and various other countries like Chile, where the CIA has operated for so long. A fascinating and informative hour coming up for you right now.
Well, you can be as sure as you are of your own name that the CIA is working in El Salvador day in and day out, round the clock, with those murderous security services in that country, and with the death squads, which are the very same as the security services. Plenty of members of those have had a change of heart and have gone public. I've seen them testify on film, in which they describe how they have worked with the CIA as members of the security and services in El Salvador, and have become then members of the death squads. These death squads have killed in the most horrible fashion more than 70,000 people in El Salvador since the massive Reagan program started in support of them in 1981. That's another 10-year period. More than 70,000 people. They pick them up, they kidnap them, they torture them for information. Sometimes they torture them to death, sometimes they execute them, and often they simply make the bodies disappear, so the families will never know whether the person is still alive or not. Other times they simply throw the bodies along the roads or into streams and lakes as a terrorist factor for the rest of the population. Well, I mentioned El Salvador. March 24th is the 10th anniversary of the assassination of Archbishop Romero. There's going to be a huge demonstration, huge I hope, in Washington, and anyone here who had the chance to go to Washington to join in would certainly be more than welcome. One more example of liaison operations, and this comes from Honduras. In 1980, the CIA set up the so-called Battalion 316 of the Honduran Army, also known as the Special Investigations Directorate. They brought them to the United States, trained them in Texas, and the unit went back and became the official death squad in Honduras. They are charged with making disappear more than, I think, 200 people in the early 1980s. And it happens also that the Inter-American Court for Human Rights, which is the judicial arm of the Organization of American States, has accepted cases brought by the survivors of the victims of this CIA-established death squad to the court against the Honduran government. And in the first cases, the court has found for the families or survivors and ordered the Honduran government to pay compensation. Well, you may wonder how successive U.S. governments or U.S. administrations have been able to get away with this type of activity. You may wonder how support for these murder security services and death squads haven't been the slightest issue in the public political discourse in this country. Well, one hint to the answer to that question comes from a poll taken about a year and a half ago on Americans' attitudes toward the government of El Salvador. You know, El Salvador has been held up by the Reagan administration for years, and now by Bush, as the showpiece for the American program for restoring democracy in Central America, or restoring what they consider to be democracy in Central America. El Salvador has received something like $4.5 billion since 1980 from the United States. As we sit here, they are receiving every day $1.5 million. And this money, of course, is going to support the type of activity I described. Well, this poll showed, it was done by a Detroit-based firm called Market Opinion Research. It showed that only 15% of Americans believe that El Salvador has a democratic government. Can you imagine, after all this propaganda from Washington about the Salvadoran government, only about 15% of Americans believe that El Salvador has a democratic government. 33% of Americans, according to the poll, don't have the slightest idea what type of government El Salvador has. But then the great revelation. According to this poll, 35% of Americans believe that El Salvador has a pro-Soviet government. The report on the poll that I read didn't say what the other 17% of Americans believe, but it wouldn't have me surprised if they had Duarte, who was then president, confused with Khomeini and thought that they had an Islamic fundamentalist government there. Obviously, it is lack of information, it's ignorance, it's disinterest, and it's apathy that has allowed the Reagan administration and now the Bush administration to get away literally with a terrorist war in Central America, and not just against Nicaragua, but in El Salvador as well, and in Guatemala. Well, I mentioned this question of restoring democracy in Latin America. When I was in the CIA, we knew all about restoring democracy by overthrowing democratically elected civilian governments and replacing them with military dictatorships of the neo-fascist stripe. There are many, many examples, but I don't have enough time to go into more than one. I'll simply mention Guatemala. Guatemala was a country that in the early 1950s had a democratically elected civilian government led by a president who was a great admirer of Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. He decided that they would install a land reform program in that country. Guatemala is like the rest of Latin America. Anyone who knows about the region knows that land tenure is one of the burning issues there. It is the source of much of the economic and social injustice in that region. It is because through the years, so few families have been able to accumulate so much of the decent and arable land, leaving the vast majority of the rural population, the peasants, either with no land at all or with plots that are too small to be economically viable. It's known as the latifundia minifundia problem in Latin America. Well, Guatemala was going to have a land reform program, but it happened that the land reform program was going to affect some of the unused lands of the United Fruit Company of Boston. It also happened that the law firm of United Fruit was the Wall Street firm Sullivan and Cromwell, which numbered among its senior partners John Foster Dulles, who was then Eisenhower's Secretary of State, and his brother Allen Dulles, who was then the director of the CIA. The two Dulles brothers, on behalf of United Fruit, declared the Guatemalan government communist, infiltrated, and a threat to U.S. national security. Eisenhower approved a CIA program to overthrow that government, and it was successful. It was a combined paramilitary, psychological, propaganda operation, and the CIA put in as president their own man, who was an army colonel, whose name was Carlos Castillo Armas. That's 1954. Guatemala has had a succession of military governments ever since. From time to time, there has been a figurehead civilian, such as right now, but Vinicio Cerezo, the current president and a Christian Democrat, is the first person to say that, well, yes, I'm president, but the real power is still with the military. In actual fact, all through the Cerezo administration, the military has really been running the country. Nobody knows how many people have been killed by these military regimes that have been supported by the United States. And you can be sure that the CIA was in there all through these 36 years now, I guess, supporting the security services. They have killed, some people estimate 100,000 people, some estimate 150,000 people, some estimate even 200,000 people. Most of these victims are highland indigenous peoples, the descendants of the Mayas, who were forced up into these marginal lands in the highlands, in the mountains, when their lands were taken over, first by the Spanish settlers and during the colonial period, and of course later on by others. Well, Chile is another example. Ecuador is another example. I worked in that. We had two military coups in Ecuador when I was there that overthrew civilian governments. Both of them we had supported and helped to provoke. Chile, of course, 1970, the people of Chile elect in free, fair, honest elections the left-wing coalition led by Salvador Allende. Nixon tells the CIA, make the economy scream, make Chile ungovernable. And in so doing, they knew that they would be able to provoke a military coup, which was the Pinochet move in 1973, which has lasted to this very day. I suppose many of you do know what happened in the wake of that military coup in 1973. Thousands of Chileans were killed. Tens of thousands were passed through the torture chambers of the Pinochet regime. And in all my travels, I have never been to a country where I did not find Chilean exiles. Well, some of you may know that in 1985, President Reagan declared a national emergency in the United States over Nicaragua. The document that he signed read, "The actions and policies of the Nicaraguan government constitute an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security of the United States." An unusual and extraordinary threat. A country of 3.1 million people, I think, no Air Force, no Navy, a land army which is trying to put down the Contras, and they are an unusual and extraordinary threat to the United States. Well, you know, Cuba is an unusual and extraordinary threat to the United States. Grenada, before the invasion or before the murder of Morris Bishop, was an unusual and extraordinary threat to the United States. Any revolutionary movement is an unusual and extraordinary threat to the United States. How? As examples. Those revolutionary movements, what do? They go in and they start literacy programs to teach people to read and write who didn't know how before. They try to extend the medical services to the countryside and to poor people who didn't know have any before or couldn't afford it. They build schools, they build clinics, they build hospitals. They build up a whole educational system. Cuba, for example, has been praised by practically everyone in the world who has visited, and this includes all sorts of international organizations for their national health program and for their educational system. Compare that with the United States having the worst educational system of any of the developed industrial democracies, and certainly no national health insurance program at all. The only industrial advanced country of a Western world that does not have one. Well, these countries, these revolutionary movements, are a threat as example to the United States because naturally their example could be very appealing to millions and millions of people in this country. And that is why all efforts are made to destroy them. Well, I finally want to end by raising the question, why? It is not enough to talk about what the CIA does and the historical dimension involved. It is also necessary to raise the question why we as a society do these things abroad. Why do we visit these atrocious crimes on people of other countries? Why do we support the institutionalization of torture in other countries? Why do we overthrow democratically elected civilian governments and replace them with military dictatorships? Why do we work with the murderous security services and death squads of other countries? Well, it's quite obvious that the foreign policy of any country is a direct product of its domestic system. This book down here by Noam Chomsky on the table is a wonderful and excellent analysis of the domestic roots of our foreign policy, and particularly what the CIA does, the state terrorism fomented through the CIA. When I came back in 1987 after all those years without a single visit, you remember what we were doing, don't you? Then in 1987. We were celebrating the 200th anniversary of the Constitution. And all of that orgy of self-congratulation reminded me of a passage in one of Chomsky's other books, his other book on Central America called Turning the Tide. In that book he discusses the Constitutional Convention of 1787 in Philadelphia, where 55 men met in total secrecy. It was more than 50 years, you know, before anything of what was said at the Constitutional Convention was made public. He wrote in his discussion of the convention how the question arose at the convention, who really is to govern the United States? And John Jay, the lawyer, had the answer. He said, you know, Jay was the president of the Continental Congress that fought the war for independence against Britain, and he was also the first Chief Justice of the United States. Jay said, well, it's pretty obvious the people who own the United States ought to govern it. And they adopted his idea. They, of course, wrote the Constitution in order to enhance and protect their private wealth. They wrote it as a document wherein power would reside in private wealth. And they proceeded to write totally out of the political process all the men without property, all the indentured laborers, all of the Native Americans, because they, of course, were savages, all of the black people, they were mostly slaves, and, of course, half the population, all the women. They were less than 10% of the population, those who could participate in the political process. Yet the Founding Fathers had the gall to start the Constitution with the words, "We the people of the United States," instead of saying, "We the rich and powerful people of the United States." Well, who were they? They were obviously the elite of colonial society. They were the merchants, the bankers, the landholders, the lawyers, the slaveholders, and so forth. They were the people who had the control, and they concentrated it in their own hands. Well, there is a wonderful book that I would like for you to take note of. I don't have it with me because I've sold so many copies of it that they have to reprint it. It is called Toward an American Revolution. Toward an American Revolution. It is by Jerry Fresia, F-R-E-S-I-A. It is a story, or it's an analysis of the U.S. Constitution and how it was adopted, and how that is the root of what I've been talking about here tonight. That's where it all goes back to. It's published by South End Press. Fresia is a PhD in political science from the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. And It is simply a marvelous book. I tell students everywhere I go that that would be the best $10 that they would spend on a book during their 4 or 5 years in university. Well, Fraser shows in that book how the Founding Fathers were scared to death of democracy. They would have nothing of it. They would have nothing of majority rule in this country. And in my opinion, today, 200 years later, but despite the amendments and despite the 200 years of legislation, the people who own the United States still govern it. They come from that 2% of American families that own 54% of the net financial assets of this country. I used to think the concentration of wealth in Latin America was a scandal until I began learning about the United States. Well, that means political repression. And that Constitution, again, is the original compact between the political forces to make the political debate in this country very narrow and to make the rules of the game very difficult to change. It is the root of the problem, or the situation, wherein when we go out to vote, and we select between Republicans and Democrats, we are simply choosing between, on the one hand, Tweedledum, and on the other, Tweedledee. Because the case has been made very convincingly by numbers of people that we really are a country of one political party with 2 branches. Well, what can we do about all this? That is also a significant question. You see down here on the table there's a book called New Voices. It's about student activism in the 1990s. Very good book for ideas and what has happened before. There's also another very good book down there called War at Home, which is a historical treatment of the repression of the peace movement in the United States with ideas about how this can be avoided in the future. But there are many local issues that one can address oneself to. I have been very active in the CIA off-campus movement. I've encouraged and participated with students in their efforts to keep the CIA from coming on campuses and recruiting. They need 1,000 new people a year by their own admission. And because they have so many PhDs, masters, more than any other people in specialized fields of research than any other U.S. government agency, they have to get these people, in most cases, from universities. And I have been working with student groups all over. There is a vast movement all over the country, from California to Maine, all over, trying to keep the CIA off campus. Because these people, and I, of course, believe that there is no justification in allowing Murder Incorporated to come onto a university campus and recruit the best of American youth for that type of work. And Murder Incorporated is not my expression. That's what President Johnson said about the CIA when he became president and learned about what they were doing in the 60s. Well, finally, I would simply say that for those who have worked in solidarity with Nicaragua or with Cuba or with the Salvadorans or with any groups, now is not the time to be a summer soldier. We have to redouble our efforts, renew the pledge to continue in this struggle on a permanent basis. We cannot let this election defeat in Nicaragua demoralize us. It certainly has not demoralized the FSLN at all. They are as confident as ever that the revolution in Nicaragua is going to go forward, and they, of course, need all of our support as much as possible. I would hope that there would be some chapter here of the Nicaragua network that could be formed, or a chapter that could be relating to CISPES, the Committee in Solidarity with the people of El Salvador, and certainly whenever the CIA comes around, you know what the answer is. Just say no. And if you ever do have the CIA come around, you can count on me or another member of our organization. We have an organization now, you know, of former CIA officers and others from the security establishment who are working to lobby Congress and to give support to the student movement, for example, in their efforts against the recruitment activities. The name is somewhat unfortunate. It's called Association of National Security Alumni, ANSECA. I wasn't around. I was in Madrid when they chose the name, but it's okay. I actually prefer the first name, the working title, when we were setting the whole group up. We're about 20 or 25 people now. But the first title I thought was much more accurate. It was De Wimke. You know what the WMKI stands for? It's the acronym for Defectors from the White Male Killer Establishment. Thank you all very much for coming tonight. Why don't we begin a discussion? Who has an observation or a question?
The first question is, what is the CIA's involvement in the savings and loans scandal?
I haven't read that material. I've simply been told about it. And what I do know is that the CIA uses all sorts of banks all over the country for transferring funds. It's necessary to, the expression goes, launder money in order to conceal the original source, which is the U.S. government, the CIA in this case. And in my time, they, in one case I remember they were using the Citibank to pour money into Chile for the 1964 elections in their support of Eduardo Frei, the Christian Democrat. But I never knew, or hadn't heard until now, that they were using savings and loan associations, or that they had a role in the collapse of any of these banks. So I'm sorry I can't really, but I hope more and more comes out on it. The Houston Chronicle has done a very good job, I think, of bringing this out.
The next question is, can you tell us how large the CIA is in terms of personnel and budget?
No, I don't think I can. Even as an employee of the CIA, I didn't know what the total budget figure was, nor did I know exactly how many employees there were. I would guess that in the 60s, the CIA had perhaps 18,000 employees. I think under Reagan that went up perhaps to 20. Maybe it's falling back somewhat now with the budget cuts. What the overall budget is, I don't know either. I didn't know when I was in the agency, although there is a figure that has been used in recent years, something like $2 billion or something like that. But when you get into those astronomical figures, to me it just has no meaning practically. It's simply an enormous amount of money. One thing that is quite clear, though, and this came out in the all through the 1980s, was that in the military buildup by the first Reagan term, the CIA got even more money in terms of percentage of increases in its budget than did the Pentagon itself. So Reagan, in that sense, kept his campaign promise. But just imagine how much money. I mean, the support to the Afghan so-called freedom fighters, these Islamic fundamentalist Neanderthals, has been costing the CIA something like $500 million a year. And that's just what the CIA gives. The Saudis give a huge amount of money, too.
The third question from the audience was about the CIA and illegal drug operations.
Well, let me tell you about a very good book. You might find it in the library, or if they don't have it here, you can have the library get it from another library. It is the best thing on the history of the CIA's involvement in the international drug traffic. It is called The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia by Alfred McCoy. I think it's out of print, but as I say, you can get it through libraries. That book shows how the CIA's association with the heroin makers around Marseille, with these operations against the trade unions there, began. And then they went out into the Far East through the CIA's support to the remnants, or to a brigade of some 10,000 people, of the nationalist Chinese army that obtained refuge in the mountains of northern Burma. They were to be the freedom fighters that would liberate China from communism. And for many years, the CIA supported them in every possible way with all kinds of logistics, food and clothing and weapons of all sorts. It happened, though, that these Chinese turned into much better poppy growers and opium cultivators than they were soldiers, and that was the beginning of the so-called Golden Triangle. But there has never been a period in which the agency has not been involved in the international drug trade, most recently with the Contras, and that was the illegal resupply to the Contras in the mid-1980s called the arms supermarket. This was when Congress had forbid any U.S. government assistance to the Contras, when the so-called Boland Amendment was in effect. Ramon Milian Rodriguez, who is a Cuban-American, an exile, who was trained by the CIA in money laundering, later put his talents at the service of the Medellin cocaine cartel. And he laundered in Panamanian banks hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars, for the cocaine cartel. He has testified before the Kerry subcommittee that on one occasion alone he delivered $10 million in cash to Felix Rodriguez, another Cuban-American, at the Ilobango Air Base in El Salvador. Felix Rodriguez was running this illegal resupply operation from that air base, and it was from that air base that Felix Rodriguez dispatched Eugene Hassenfuss on that flight when he was shot down. And it was Felix Rodriguez who made the first telephone call to announce that Hassenfuss had been shot down. And where does he make that telephone call to but to Bush's office? It has also been, pilots have testified that they were flying weapons down to Central America for the Contras and bringing cocaine back into the United States, landing at U.S. military bases with impunity. In Oliver North's cryptic notes that he was not able to erase from the computer before he had to leave the National Security Council offices, there were such things as armed supermarket financed by drugs. Felix, meaning Felix Rodriguez down at Ilopango, Felix talks too much about the VP connection. Those sorts of things. Another Cuban exile. Excuse me. Luis Posada Carriles. Luis Posada was in a Venezuelan prison for having been one of the participants in the bombing of the Cuban airliner in 1976 when all 73 people, I think it was, aboard were killed. He was one of the ones responsible. He was in prison in Venezuela. Somehow he walks out of that prison, and where does he turn up as Felix Rodriguez's right-hand man at the Ilopango Air Base in El Salvador. Well, there's a lot more to all these stories too, but I just mention it because the Vice President's office, from all appearances, was running that illegal resupply operation. Speaking of drugs, for example, I've often wondered why, with all the military and the Coast Guard and the FBI and the DEA and the CIA and on, why they have not been able to stop the inflow of drugs such as cocaine and crack into the United States. It seems to me that with all that force, they would be able to. At the same time, someone mentioned the Bush war on drugs. Well, Bush was from 1981 on the czar. I mean, he headed up the South Florida anti-drug thing, which was then turned into a whole national thing. He has been the head of the whole drug repression program from the beginning of the Reagan administration. I can't say that he's been exactly successful, except that there is, in fact, a certain political dividend, not to say that this is planned this way, but there is a certain political dividend in that for every ghetto youth or every one of the millions of young people who stand everything to gain with fundamental political change in this country, for every one of them who is taken off on crack or on heroin or cocaine, that is one potential political activist less. And they are taking out a whole generation of young people by getting them on drugs.
Next was a series of questions about the American invasion of Panama. The first one was asking Phil Agee's opinion of the performance of the American mass media.
This bulletin called Extra here is a very good analysis of the media, the U.S. corporate media, and that whole issue, or most of it, is dedicated to how the U.S. media played cheerleader to Bush's invasion of Panama and also helped to cover up the real truth. I just read over the weekend a report prepared by a commission from the National Lawyers Guild, which went down to Panama. The Guild, you know, has about 8,000 or 10,000 members, lawyers all over the country. And they sent a delegation of, I think, 6 people. They spent about 2 weeks there. They talked to human rights groups. They talked to church people. They talked to ordinary people in the streets. They talked to grave diggers. They talked to people who worked in hospitals and so forth. They were trying to find out, among other things, how many people really were killed. And it seems that the evidence is overwhelming that the Bush administration's figure of 202, I think it is now, reduced from about 250 to 202, non-combatant deaths, and about 347 members of the Panamanian Defense Forces is just grossly underestimating. The Lawyers Guild people estimate that more than 2,000 people were killed in that invasion. And it sounds totally reasonable, especially from the people at the cemeteries where they were burying all these people in mass graves. And these people they talked to were counting the bodies. And at this point, I think there's something like 25,000 refugees thanks to the invasion. Panama has gone completely out of the news, hasn't it? But there are 25,000 people whose homes have been destroyed. And of course, they're all poor people to begin with. You didn't think the Bush administration was going to go in there and attack any rich neighborhoods. Of course not, the poor neighborhoods. And these people don't have the slightest hope of getting any place to live for more than a year. And they don't even know when they'll ever get a place to live. In one instance, consider this. There is a hangar, aircraft hangar at Albrook Air Force Base, one of the U.S. bases there, holding now 3,000 refugees. They are being held in cubicles 6 feet by 6 feet square with a partition between the one and the other of only 6 feet tall. And these are families. Imagine no privacy, nothing. And they have no hope of getting out of that hangar before the end of this year, and they probably won't, maybe they won't even get out sometime next year. There is also a very good media publication down there called Lies of Our Times, which also deals with Panama. And this is a new publication, started in January, and the January and February issues are there. Lies of Our Times, or LOOT for short. Times being mostly the New York Times, on how it uninforms or disinforms or misinforms its readers as the newspaper of record in this country. It's just amazing to read that, because people are doing such wonderful analyses of how distorted and misleading is the New York Times coverage of major news events. So that is one of the things we're all up against right now, is the major news media. How do we keep ourselves informed, really, and not fall victim to believing that what we're told in the press and the other media is true. And of course on television it's even worse, because that's showbiz. That's not even the news that comes across on television is simply show business. It's not really news at all. And that's why I emphasize so much the importance of reading.
In a follow-up question, it was asked whether the United States was going to rebuild Panama.
Well, presumably the poor neighborhoods will be rebuilt. I don't know if any of you saw President Bush's press conference on Saturday, but he is now asking, get this, he's asking the Japanese to help rebuild what the United States destroyed in Panama and in Nicaragua. Can you believe it? Asking the Japanese to help rebuild. I think that's the ultimate disgrace for the United States, but we get what we deserve, don't we? I would say 95% of Americans, perhaps not, but my impression is that perhaps 95% of Americans, or even more, really do believe that the purpose of the invasion was to get Noriega for drug trafficking. The real reason for the invasion of Panama was to keep the U.S. military bases after 1999. The Carter-Torrijos treaties call for a turnover of the 14 U.S. military bases, which occupy an enormous area of Panamanian land. Turn those bases over at the same time the canal is turned over at the end of 1999. In 1987, the Reagan administration asked the Panamanian government, i.e. Noriega, to amend the treaty so that the U.S. could keep those bases after 1999. Noriega said no. The decision was then taken to get rid of Noriega at all costs, because they want to keep those bases. You know, from those bases in Panama, the National Security Agency, through military detachments, listens to all the communications in Latin America, South America, Central America, and the Caribbean. It's a very valuable piece of real estate for intelligence collection, and they listen to the telephones and radio broadcasts of the whole region from there. And of course the bases are very useful as forward staging areas for a U.S. intervention anywhere in Latin America, and also as a threat to Nicaragua from the south. To go with the threat from the north, the U.S. bases in Honduras. The decision was taken to use the CIA to buy the elections coming up in 1989. And the agency poured in something like $10 million to those elections in Panama last May. Noriega, knowing that it wasn't covered up very well. Most of the money came in through Venezuela. It wasn't covered up very well. Noriega knew it, and that's the reason he annulled the elections. The decision then was taken to go ahead and invade. But there were 3 years of this wonderful American pastime of demonization, wherein over these last 3 years, Noriega was turned into a monster. Why? So that the American people would accept the invasion, accept the loss of young American lives to get at that drug dealer. Well, Noriega was no more a drug dealer than the generals in Panama, the generals in Honduras, who have been doing the very same thing. But they are useful to the United States because they are the way the Contras have been maintained all through these years. Noriega was simply no longer of use to the United States. In fact, he had become an embarrassment, and they had to get rid of him. But the main reason was not the drug trafficking, it was to keep the base. And you will see that with the establishment of this so-called Fuerza Pública, the new police there's not going to be an army, and there is every reason then for the United States to keep the bases for the defense of the canal, since Panama has no army. And that's just what they're going to do, and they're going to use this puppet government in there to change the treaties so that the bases can remain.
One questioner asked Phil Agee if he thought that Noriega might get off because he knows too many sensitive secrets.
I can't tell you. He's worked with the CIA. Some cases stay as far back as, some reports say as far back as the 50s. Certainly from the 60s on, he was working with the CIA, and he knows an awful lot. Whether that can come out or not, I don't know. It may be that he will try to reveal information that will be so embarrassing that they won't be able to prosecute him. And they can always use SIPA to drop the charges and get him into exile in the Dominican Republic or someplace. SIPA being the Classified Information Procedures Act, which is the tool by the attorney that the Attorney General has used to protect Reagan and Bush. He's used it to drop the charges. This is to prevent the release of classified information through trials, you know, and it dates from a couple of years ago. It's supposedly to protect classified information, but in actual fact, it's used to protect people like Reagan and Bush. The charges against Joe Fernandez, the criminal charges, he was the CIA chief of station in Costa Rica. They were all dropped against him. Many of the charges against Oliver North were dropped because of SIPA, and supposedly to protect classified information, when in actual fact it is to prevent information from becoming public knowledge that would embarrass Reagan or Bush.
A person in the audience then asked former CIA official Agee if the CIA under President Carter was much better than that under Reagan.
It's rather hard to say. Admiral Turner has written a book about his experience as a CIA director during the Carter years. And it certainly is true that I think by all accounts that there was a lot less meddling in the internal affairs of other countries under Carter. The trouble with Carter's human rights policy was that there were all sorts of exceptions on national security grounds, wherein U.S. military and security assistance could keep going to countries like South Korea, which was a military dictatorship of the bloodiest sort. And so, yes, you have to say that Carter did make a difference, but he also tried to prevent the Sandinista revolution from succeeding. He tried to, in the last days of Somoza, he tried to organize the other Latin American countries through the Organization of American States to intervene and prevent the FSLN from their rightful victory, having fought against Somoza all those years. The other Latin American countries would have nothing to do with it, and the FSLN, of course, came in. But in any case, Carter was somewhat better, certainly far, far better than Reagan and Bush in terms of the human rights and the use of the CIA as a national intelligence service to do these things that I've been talking to you about.
Next, a question about the Kennedy assassination.
Read this book down here on the table called On the Trail of the Assassins. It's the very best book on the Kennedy assassination. It's written by Jim Garrison, who was the Los Angeles district attorney who prosecuted the only criminal case in the wake of the Kennedy assassination. You will not be able to put it down. I I promise you. There he shows, as Norman Mailer says in a promotional blurb on the dust jacket, he shows that the conspiracy to kill Kennedy was elements, certain people in the CIA, in the in the CIA, the Mafia, the Cuban exile community, the Secret Service, and the Dallas Police. All of these people had some participation in it, in this conspiracy to kill Kennedy. And the reason was that he had decided to withdraw from Vietnam, for one thing, and to seek improved relations with Cuba on the other. It's a terrific book. I recommend it very highly.
Phil Agee was then asked if there are any people within the CIA who are quietly trying to reform things within the organization. And if there are such people, how are they treated by the agency?
There are examples of people who have tried to do something from the inside and who have been given the cold shoulder, or have been even fired or forced to resign, or simply shunted aside and put in a cubbyhole until they retire. Ralph McGee is one of those people. He tried to make changes from within, from the inside, and his career more or less came to a stop. He just stayed on about 5 or 10 years more to get his pension, and he's written a wonderful book called My 25 Years in the CIA, published by Sheridan Square Press. There's a man who was a tackle on those national championship Notre Dame football teams of the late 1940s and early 50s, and he was driven to nearly committing suicide in Vietnam because of the work that the CIA was doing to promote political repression in that country. There are plenty of CIA people on the inside who realize that who turn off to the work, but who are stuck with, as I said, mortgages and so forth, and they simply spend the rest of their years there pushing papers and waiting until they can resign and get their pension.
Phil was then asked if he still feels threatened by the U.S. government, considering the treatment that he's received in the past.
I don't feel personally threatened at all. I have never been working alone in any of this activity. I've always been working with others, and the time when I did feel vulnerable was the time when I was beginning or working on my first book. Nobody knew my name then, and when these people started following me around in the streets of Paris, I was worried. I didn't know what they were going to do. I then, as I said, went off and lived in secret. But I found out later on, years later, in a Marathon Freedom of Information Act lawsuit that I had against the government, against the State Department, the CIA, the Pentagon, the Justice Department, the FBI, and so forth, I discovered through documents which I was given by the Criminal Division of the Justice Department that in the early 1970s, when I was working on my first book, the CIA committed crimes against me. We are still struggling in court to get the documents showing the exact nature of those crimes. It happened that in 1975, the CIA tried to get, this is Colby when he was director of the CIA, they tried to get a criminal indictment against me from the Justice Department. And so the Justice Department did what they call a prosecutorial investigation. That is when they go out and get all the facts. And they had to take to a grand jury for the indictment. They had to go to the CIA, of course, and review the CIA's files, and they told the CIA, well, you know, you've been committing crimes against this man. And if we indict him, he will have access to all this information through criminal discovery procedure. And the CIA said, no, that can never see the light of day. That information can never come out. And so they had to drop the effort to get the indictment. They also started prosecutorial investigations of the CIA people for what they had done against me. And we simply don't know. In the end, they didn't prosecute the CIA people, they didn't prosecute me. But it could have been a plot for assassination. They were doing that back in those days. It could have been kidnapping of some sort. But it certainly was illegal. There's no question about that from the documents. And one day maybe I'll know. But once the CIA made me a public figure, I didn't worry anymore. And they did that on the 4th of July of 1974 with a fairy tale put on the front page with big headlines of the New York Times about this former CIA officer who in 1972 was drunk and despondent and telling everything he knew to the KGB. I got that, and I just couldn't believe it. I hadn't been in Latin America. I was a person, of course. I hadn't been in Latin America in 1972 at all. I had certainly never talked to the KGB. And it was their way of getting in the first blow to discredit me, because they knew my name was going to come out in a few days in connection with the Watergate investigations. And so that was the beginning of it. After that, a few months later, my first book was published, and it was that notoriety then that was a protection. And so I've never been afraid, never been nervous, and certainly never allowed myself to be paralyzed by fear that someone was going to take any action, because anything that happened to me, of course, the CIA would be blamed.
Considering the CIA's past record of abuses and atrocities, do the young people in the CIA who are actually working for the agency really believe it's a good organization?
It's very hard to generalize on that. We've had a hall here tonight which is full. I think it holds 600 people. There are 600 people who are not going to walk away from here without knowing what's going on. One of the problems, of course, is information. And the information is all there. But we are brought up to believe that this is the best of all possible worlds for most of us. And unfortunately, we believe the myths that have been traditional in the United States about the benevolence of American society. I can't give you the answer to the question, really. I know that there is a very enthusiastic turnout when I go around, just like there has been tonight. People have been interested, they've been informed, and I hope they go away with some kind of determination to do something, whether it's in the ecology movement or whether it's in whatever type of activity. Whether it's political or what. But it is a steady struggle to try to get the information across. And one of the main problems is that there are so many distractions in this country. I mean, students have to study, and they have to get through to get their degrees. And then there are careers, then there are families, there are house mortgages, and so forth. That's one of the things about CIA officers, that by the time they may come to a certain awareness, like I did, of what the real meaning of the work was, they are saddled with children to educate, car payments and house payments to make, and it is very, very difficult, I can tell you, to make the adjustment. You have to be willing to give up a lot. And if I had known really what the problems were going to be, who knows if I would even have done what I did, but I just took it day by day, step by step.
Well, I see we have time for a couple of news stories.
A story in these times for April 4th gives us a real good insight on the interlocking relationship of the media, the CIA, and the State Department. And another aspect we'll get to at the end. Thomas Friedman is currently the New York Times superstar. He's the chief diplomatic correspondent. Well, it was recently indicated that he had spent the summer of 1975 working with the CIA in an internship program. As a matter of fact, this is a story that originally was in the Village Voice. Thomas Friedman helped prepare classified intelligence digests and information for the CIA. He subsequently served in Beirut and Jerusalem, picked up a couple of Pulitzer Prizes along the way. So the Friedman also, during all this period, said next to nothing about the CIA and all its activities in the Middle East. There's another aspect of this story, and that is that Friedman is a big man. He covers the State Department now, and his access to Secretary of State James Baker is the envy of the Washington Press Corps, according in these times. As a matter of fact, Baker is known to call Friedman late at night and check out stories and get his opinion on certain things, and they even play tennis together. And Friedman now promotes Baker's views in his dispatches and articles. Well, that got me thinking. I know that James Baker, who's Secretary of State, like almost every Secretary of State since World War I, has been a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, that bedrock organization where most of our leaders come from and where most of the important policies are determined before they're implemented by our government. So I thought, do you suppose that Thomas Friedman is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations? So I looked at my little book. Aha, Friedman. Thomas, there he is, New York Times. Also, a significant change in the Council on Foreign Relations roster, and that is that every man who is an anchor person of the network Evening News is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations now. And also, the two guys who do McNeil and Lehrer on PBS are members of the Council on Foreign Relations now, as well as many people from the New York Times and the Washington Post. A small organization, the Council on Foreign Relations, but it has all the significant people who really count. And they're all interlocked, and they talk together, and oh, it's wonderful. That's how the system stays the same.
Well, there's a good analysis of George Bush's rhetoric on Bush speak by Maureen Dodd in the New York Times last Sunday. She describes how our president talks really funny. He gets all tangled in wayward clauses and preppy adverbs, dangling predicates and galloping gerunds. He's never met a pronoun that he liked or a non sequitur that he could resist. So she gives some examples of Bush speak. So here's the sort of surreal rhetoric that we get out of our president. When he was asked by a Knoxville high school student in Tennessee who wanted to know if he would seek ideas overseas to improve American education, here was his answer. Well, I'm going to kick that one right into the end zone of the Secretary of Education. But yes, we all have. He travels a good deal, goes abroad. We have a lot of people in the department that does that. We're having an international, this is not so much in education as dealing with the environment, a big international conference coming up. And we get it all the time, you know, exchanges of ideas. But I think we set out there, and I want to give credit to your Governor McWhirter and to your former Governor Lamar Alexander. We've gotten great ideas for a national goals program in this country from the governors who are responding to maybe the principal of your high school, for heaven's sake. So that's a good example of Bush speak. That's a verbatim answer he gave to high school students in Tennessee. And for my final example of the sublime vision that Bush projects in his vision of America. At a fundraising luncheon in Omaha, Nebraska, Bush finally articulated his vision for America, saying, "We need to keep America what a child once called the nearest thing to heaven, and lots of sunshine, places to swim, and peanut butter sandwiches." That's Bush's vision for America. A verbatim quote. Let's bring on Dan Quayle.
I think Quayle is his speechwriter. That brings us to the end of another Alternative Views. Glad you could join us. Frequently hear from viewers who request a list of news publications, which we use on Alternative Views, and also a reading list for U.S. power structure in the mass media. If you would like to have these, send a stamped, self-addressed envelope to the Alternative Information Network, P.O. Box 7279, Austin, Texas 78713. You must send a self-addressed stamped envelope. We also can give you information on how to get John Stockwell's publications. Special thanks goes to Paul Jankowski, who arranged for us to get the Phil Agee speech. Alternative Views is a production of the Alternative Information Network, P.O. Box 7279, Austin, Texas 78713. Goodbye.